agitator, opportunist, or just defending its own interests? As Russia's relations with the West grow worse by the day, what exactly is Moscow up to on the world stage, and has Putin outmaneuvered Western leaders? This is Inside Story. Hello, warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem, Sika. Perhaps not since the Cold War have Western leaders, thinkers and commentators spoken out so strongly against Russian foreign policy. Today, Russia stands accused of destabilizing its neighbor Ukraine by arming and supporting separatists in the east. And Russian obstructionism has been blamed for the UN Security Council's failure to pass a resolution on the war in Syria. If Western leaders are to be believed, Russia is playing a dangerous game with the rest of the world. Of course, the image that Russian President Vladimir Putin paints of his country could not be more different. He accuses the West of showing a complete disregard for Russia's national interests. And Putin insists Russia will continue to pursue an independent foreign policy despite what he calls today's challenging international environment. So as we've been saying, Russia sees itself as being under attack from Western countries. In Ukraine, Putin has said the conflict there is a result of the West trying to force countries to choose between Russia and Europe. In Syria, Russia has been a long-time supporter of the Assad government and has repeatedly pushed for peace talks instead of military action. And in a reminder that Russia will go out and find new partners if it needs to, Putin met Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi on Tuesday. The two announced a whole range of deals, including a plan for Egypt's first nuclear power plant. Along the same lines as Greece's relationship with the European Union strains, Russia has shown a growing willingness to help the country rebuild. So let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. Joining me from London, we have Domitilla Sagramoso, Russia and Caucasus analyst from the Department of War at King's College in London. In Washington, D.C., we have Lukey, Coffey, a Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And joining me here in the studio in Doha, Remi Piet, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at Qatar University and author of Shifting Priorities in Russia's Foreign and Security Policy. Good to have you all with us. Let me start with you then, Remi. How do you see Russia's place in the world in 2015?
In 2015, definitely you have seen an evolution since the end of the Soviet Union, where you do have a crumbling Soviet Union, and then now you have a rise of power of Russia that wants to make it clear that it is not ready to accept that more and more countries at its border will actually turn its back to Moscow and turn towards the European Union. I think there's a real feeling of feeling threatened in Russia, of seeing Ukraine drift away from what was the initial plan of the Kremlin, which was having it part of the Eurasian Union that would counterbalance with the European Union, and instead seeing it move towards potentially NATO and towards the European Union. The question is really in this conflict, seeing what it's going to be a good way to actually realize if Russia is a great power, if Russia is capable of implementing its own ambitions, and whether or not the European Union will actually cave in front of this new reaffirmed Russia under Vladimir Putin.
Domitilla Sagramoso, is that how you see it? I mean, how do you view Russia's place in the world right now? And can it play a constructive role in addressing some of the challenges the world's facing right now? And if so, what should it be?
I think potentially Russia could play a very positive role together with Europe and the United States, primarily when we think about the fight against radical Islamic jihadism, as we see with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So I think there are many areas where our vital interests are at play, and Russia's as well. So I think there could be a lot of room for cooperation. But as was pointed out, Russia very soon sided very much with the Assad regime because it perceived it as the only really capable of fighting any kind of extremism. So to a certain extent, it came into sort of a collision course with the West. But I think now there's much more of a possibility of cooperation. I think as far as Ukraine is concerned, I think their situation is a lot more complex and difficult because I think that the positions of the parties are very far apart. The visions that each other has of what should happen in East Ukraine are very different. So I think that there it's going to be very hard to reach a settlement. I would argue that although, of course, Ukraine has every right to choose its path towards Europe, I think it's a lot more tricky when we talk about military alliances. And I think I take the view that Russia has a sort of legitimate security concern if it sees the NATO-Atlantic alliance moving closer to its borders. So I think that one way out of this problem would be if we make sure that Ukraine remains a neutral state, of course indivisible in the sense that the territorial integrity of Ukraine remains respected, but to a certain extent it doesn't really become an area of confrontation between Russia and the West.
Luke Coffey, what's your take on this? And I want to put to you the point that Domitilla just raised there about Russia's concerns about Western expansion, more specifically NATO expansion into the East, the former Eastern Bloc countries. Isn't Russia entitled to be concerned about that?
Well, Russia is always going to pursue what it believes to be its national interests. Firstly, I would like to also remind the viewers that it's not just eastern Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula has been illegally annexed and is occupied by Russia. So we shouldn't forget about that. And too often we dismiss Crimea as if it's not really part of Ukraine's territorial integrity. But going to your specific point about westward expansion, NATO expansion, European Union expansion, we have to understand that the decision to join these alliances must be taken in an open and democratic process. And then, on the other hand, the members of these alliances have to all vote democratically to allow a new country to join. So it's a very democratic process. And the people of Ukraine should have the right to choose which alliances they would like to be in. It could be with the Eurasian Economic Union. It could be with the European Union. They could someday join NATO. But it should be up to the people of Ukraine to decide, not commentators on the airwaves, and certainly not anyone in Moscow. And at the end of the day, you know, NATO is a defensive security alliance. It's not an offensive security alliance. And perhaps we can make it clearer to Russia that we in NATO don't want to, present any sort of clear and present danger to Moscow. It's a defensive alliance built around the idea of defending territorial integrity, not expansionism.
But just to pick up on the point that you made about Ukraine and what you're saying is a Russian interference in Ukrainian affairs, they would see it very much the other way as American and European interference in Ukrainian affairs, because there was a deal in place before hostilities broke out that would have kept Yanukovych, the president at that time, would have kept him in power. And the accusation from Russia and from people in the east of Ukraine is that EU interference scuppered that deal.
Well, I think that's fanciful thinking. I don't think that's how the situation panned out at all. What we saw was a popular uprising on the streets of Kiev and the other major cities, demonstrating that the people of Ukraine, well, at least in central and western Ukraine, want a different path. They want to choose their own destiny. But we should make no illusions about the division inside Ukraine. You're absolutely right. So there are the people living in eastern Ukraine and Donetsk, Luhansk, and even Kharkiv Oblast. They, in the recent parliamentary elections, they voted overwhelmingly for the opposition party. So there is a divide in Ukraine, and this is an issue that is going to have to be worked out on the national level in Kiev. The central government needs to work out a deal to address some of the legitimate grievances that people in eastern Ukraine, the ethnic Russian population in Ukraine, might have against the rest of the country. But this is no excuse for any country in the world to go in and cause this sort of instability and insecurity in eastern Ukraine and outright annex the Crimean Peninsula.
Domitilla Sagramoso, is Russia entitled to be concerned when it sees bases being expanded into new NATO countries in the east that were formerly under the Russian sphere?
I think there are a variety of points. On the one hand, of course, Russia is worried if you see a military alliance moving closer to the borders. Of course, countries have a right to choose, but then they have to bear the consequences. And when we're talking about a military alliance, we're not simply talking about just a club of friendly people. I mean, this is a risk and a threat, and it is perceived as such, and one should be aware of the consequences. And I fully agree that Russia has no right to annex Crimea or to interfere illegally in the affairs of a neighboring state. But at the same time, it has a right to be worried and to be concerned and to ask for some sort of neutrality along its borders, to feel safe. On the other hand, I fully agree that countries should allow their populations to choose, but the case of Ukraine was very clearly a very divided situation. There were a lot of people in Ukraine which did not want to be part of NATO, and we've seen that already at the times when the president was Yushchenko. There was only a 33% of the population who wanted to join NATO. So with a country who is so divided, to really insist on membership is, I think, very risky internally. So we are in a way creating this instability by even discussing the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. I think that the best security and guarantee for Ukraine, for its stability, for its internal development, is if we ensure that it is a neutral country that chooses the way, the economic union it wants to choose, and both Russia and Europe help this country get out of its economic morass, which it finds itself now. It is a real problem for the people of Ukraine. And I don't think their situation would be any better by becoming members of NATO. It would just be even more unstable. So NATO should not be an end in itself. It should be just a means which helps ensure country securities if it can and if all people are happy with it. But that's not the case of Ukraine. And there are a lot of problems in the East, and their views are very mixed. And especially after the war, in the East, the opinions of people are a lot more hostile now to Kiev, unfortunately.
Remi Piet, are there not areas of common concern that Russia and a number of countries in the West can find common ground on? And is that the way forward, do you think?
Well, there's actually two levels that we need to address here. There's the domestic level of question of how decisions are taken inside Ukraine, and here you have two positions that are fairly opposed one to another. The Ukraine, the Kiev perspective is indeed a decentralization maybe of decision making, but still main decision being taken in Kiev, while the eastern regions, and I would agree that we need not forget about Crimea, would be actually calling for a federalism, a place where the eastern regions will decide for the eastern region. That's domestic. Inside Ukraine, the separation of power and the decision making, whether we're talking about trade issues or we're talking about election issues. The Eastern Republic are asking for the elections that were held in Donetsk and in Eastern Republic to be recognized from Kiev, which is not going to happen from the Kiev perspective. The second level of analysis is the international level of analysis, which we mentioned, which is the question of international alliances. And here again, we have two different perspectives. We have the perspective from the West saying that NATO is indeed a defensive alliance and here to protect in case of attack on the territorial integrity, but absolutely from the Russian perspective, the defensive alliance moving forwards towards them is a threat. The question is, how are we going to be able to find a common ground here in Minsk? Again, you have two perspectives, the European one and the American one. The European being maybe a little bit more vanilla compared to the American one, trying to find maybe gain some time, making sure that the ceasefire that this time will hold, not the one in September that actually never held, and also trying to maybe put a little pause in the system, try to agree on reassuring the Russian that NATO is maybe not aiming at taking Ukraine as part of their members, and also finding some kind of a common ground on the decision-making processes.
Well, let's just pause for a moment and give you just a little bit of background on this and just let you know that Russia is the largest country in the world at 17 million square kilometers. That's 60% bigger than the second largest country, Canada. As for economic size, Russia had the 9th largest economy last year, but that's a pretty big drop from 2013 when it had the 6th largest. And despite its current economic troubles, Russia is a huge spender when it comes to defense. Moscow is expected to spend about $81 billion on its military this year, more than a third of Russia's budget. It's also the world's second largest exporter of oil, but it only represents 2.6% of the world economy. Compare that to the United States, which stands at 22%. So some facts and figures that do help to kind of put things in perspective a little bit there. And I want to pick on the economic troubles that Russia is going through right now. Luke Coffey, I mean, isn't this going to, I mean, in particular when we look at sanctions and the effect that is having on Russia, isn't that going to have the effect of simply making Russia go elsewhere for economic partnerships? Will it really have a detrimental effect in the long run?
The type of sanctions that we're seeing against Russia right now are very targeted sanctions. So they haven't quite filtered their way down to the average Russian person. The impact hasn't, I mean. But what I think is really hurting the Russian economy is the price of oil, and this is an indirect result of nothing the U.S. or the West is doing. In fact, this is most likely a result of Saudi Arabia flooding the global market with oil in an attempt to put U.S. frackers out of business. And this is having a dire consequence for many countries who rely on the export of hydrocarbons, and in particular Russia. So for Russia, this is a perfect storm. You have financial sanctions that are starting to bite, but they're very targeted. But coupled with that, you have this price in oil. Can Russia look elsewhere? Well, you can't just flip a switch and change the direction of travel for your economies. You can try to trade more outside the West and outside Europe, but this is going to take time to put into place, and there's no guarantee that there's always going to be a market there for your goods.
Domitilla Sagramoso, if some countries decide to cut themselves off from Russia economically, that will be their loss, won't it? I mean, will Russia then just simply expand relations with other countries?
I agree with the previous speaker. I think Russia is in a very dire situation, primarily because of the collapse of the oil prices and as a result of gas prices as well. I think it will take time. Still, European countries are buying a lot of Russian gas, and that I think will stay for quite a long while. I mean, there is a possibility also to develop fields which satisfy Eastern Asian customers, but I think still for quite a while the interdependency will be there. And I think that for the average Russian, very slowly you will feel they will start feeling the pain. If you read now the news on Russia, there's constantly reference to the crisis, to the difficulties that the population are going through, to collapse in prices, to lack of certain medicines, or the increase in importing a lot of material. And this is added to the sanctions that the Russians themselves, or sort of the freezing of imports from a lot of goods from Europe. So I think that the population will very soon feel the pinch of these sort of countermeasures, of the fall of oil, of the sanctions. I think it's going to start affecting them. I don't think it's going to change the behavior of Putin's foreign policy, but it's going to make the regime a lot less, legitimate and stronger. And I think that is, in a way, the only chance to make sure that eventually there is a policy which is a bit more accommodating to what the West would like. So I think that in a way, if the West is a bit patient in the long run, I think it is in a stronger position. But I think that the emergency today is the economy of Ukraine as well, which is rarely addressed. No one talks very much about the fact that last week the currency collapsed significantly, that there is a lot of money that the economy needs, and it's not clear who's going to put it, because the European Union and the US are not ready to fill in all the gaps. So I think there is a room for cooperation.
Remi Piet, how do you see Russia's current economic troubles figuring into President Putin's foreign policy at the moment?
Well, I agree with the two first previous speakers. I would add the fact that I think the Russian population already feels the impact of the crisis, not through the specific sanctions, which indeed are very targeted, or from the potential, the actual drop on the oil price, but also through market forces. I mean,
but at the moment, at the moment, they're not blaming this on Putin, are they? He remains a very popular leader.
He is, but in the short run he is, but in the long run, when we're actually seeing the value of the currency in Russia that has plummeted compared to last year. The staggering amount of capital flight out of Russia. We don't live anymore in a cold world. We actually live in a globalized economy where the private investors now decide not to invest anymore in Russia, what they used to do in the past, not bring the technology which is in dire needs for Russia's future. And you already see, because of the decrease of the price of ruble, the price of imports is staggeringly way higher than it used to be in the past. I agree also that we have to concentrate on something that we don't talk enough, which is the Ukrainian economy itself. Neither the Russians are ready to help, the capacity to help the Donbass region or the separatist region, and if the Kiev authority would agree to some kind of a compromise, and yet that's not likely. Kiev is not ready to actually provide the support, economic support to the eastern region. So we're going to have, especially at a moment of overall uncertainty in terms of European economy, we're going to have dire situation for population in the eastern part of Ukraine and Crimea, because they are the ones suffering from the conflict right now.
Domitilla, is the West kind of could they be doing more to bring Russia in as a partner in certain areas, particularly in Syria with the expansion of ISIL right now? Surely that is something where they can find some common ground.
I think that's an area where they could find a lot of common ground, but still the positions are not clear in the West as to whether they want to continue with a policy which was previously there of toppling the Assad regime, or actually working in cooperation and supporting it. Assad said a few days ago in an interview that he's been informed about the attacks that the West is conducting on ISIS, so there seems to be some kind of rapprochement, and if this happens, then there is room for Russia and the West to work together. I think that in a way they are already in a similar line, and I think there is a possibility there that needs to be exploited. Of course, these big tensions at the level of the European theater make it much harder to work effectively on different fronts, as they did, for example, on Afghanistan, where a lot of the transport used to necessary for delivering military and any other kind of support for the operation of NATO in Afghanistan used to go through Russian territory. So this was happening behind sort of a lot of issues of lack of cooperation. So I think there is a room there, but it's very hard often to make it happen, because we see so many sectors where actually the US, for example, and Russia no longer cooperating on nuclear security issues, which are extremely dangerous, because again, we could find ourselves with the concerns we had right after 9/11 and the risk of a dirty bomb and bombs, WMD material falling in the hands of terrorists. So here, we're moving backwards instead of forwards. And I think it's very important that the US and Russia cooperate on nuclear safety and the security of weaponry in the former Soviet space, especially in Russia, of course.
Let's put that point then to Luke Coffey. Surely the issue of nuclear safety is something that both sides can agree on here. That's got to be something that they can work together on. And issues as well like Syria. What's your view on that?
Well, I agree. There are areas where the West and Russia should be cooperating, and sadly, we're not. Also, to throw into the mix, I would say the Arctic. There are lots of Arctic issues, not necessarily of the military or security type, but of the economic and safety aspects of the Arctic region, where the West and the U.S. and Russia can all be cooperating, but we're not really seeing it as a consequence of what's going on in eastern Ukraine. With Syria, I think Russia and the West want the same conclusion in terms of combating ISIL, but they have a different way of going about it. Russia, of course, thinks we need to secure and back up Assad to take on the terrorists, and then, of course, the West and the U.S. would like to see both of them, Assad and ISIL, disappear. But when it comes to Russia, the Russian economy and bringing Russia into the international community, this is why we have to be very careful with sanctions, and this is why I think we've seen only targeted sanctions so far. For the last 20 years or so, since the end of the Cold War, the West and the United States in particular has done a lot to try to get Russia integrated into the global economy, joining the World Trade Organization, things of this nature. So we don't want to see sanctions that are so severe that can bring down the whole house in Russia. Often you hear people say they fear a resurgent Russia. I personally think a degenerate Russia is what we should fear, a Russia that can't keep it all together, that fractures, that fails. This is what's dangerous for the U.S. and for Europe.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests, Domitilla Sagramoso, Luke Coffey, and Remi Piet. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And that's it for another show. Remember, if you've got anything to add to today's show, you can just go to our program page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or send your tweets to us on Twitter at AJ Inside Story is the address there. I'm Hazem Sika. From the whole team, bye for now.